All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Michigan's Children's Lunch and Learn, Federal Tides and Michigan Ways. We're going over the latest on budgets and shifts in child policy. As recently as Friday, the state budget passed, and so we're here to break that down a little bit for you, tell you what's in it for children, family, and advocates. So for our agenda, we're gonna have a brief overview by our CEO, President Matt Gillard. Our policy associate, Maddie Elliott, will be covering early childhood. Our policy associate, Bianca Miles, will be covering child welfare. Our policy consultant, Pam Cornell Allen, will be going over runaway and homeless youth. Our president, Matt, and policy associate, Bianca, will be going over K-12 education. And our vice president, Dr. Heather Bomsta, will be going over higher education. And then we'll have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. Also, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, say where you're from, what organization you're from, or the region of Michigan that you're in. And we're going to get started right away. All right, take it away, Matt.
All right. Thanks, Stephen. And thanks everybody for joining us. So a week later than what we were, I guess, somewhat foolishly hoping for or hoping to be able to report on the state budget a week ago on July 1st, which was the actual statutory deadline for the legislature to pass a budget for the next fiscal year. They unfortunately blew through that again, but not nearly as long as they did last year. So I'm going to start, as Steven said, I'll just give a little bit of overview of the process, some highlights, and then we'll turn it over to the real stars of the show, our team here at Michigan's Children, to go through in some more detail. As Steven indicated, this past early Friday morning, well, about 9 o'clock Friday morning, finally, we're still pouring through. It's over 1,500 pages in total. A lot in there, and then some companion policy bills that went along with this as well. So a whole lot of information, obviously. But we are going to report on some of the highlights and some of the areas that we've been focused on and we've been covering throughout the last several months as this process has gone on. And then, like Stephen said, we'll answer any questions folks have, or if we don't have the answers yet, we'll commit to getting them to you. And we're expecting to put out our budget basics, which will go into much more detail around all of these issues and the totality of the budget here soon. So look for that from us as well. I guess what I would say about the process itself and the budget overview is it's still really messed up. Obviously, it's not as bad as it was last year, where we went right up to the October 1 deadline and beyond. With a really dysfunctional process in the legislature. We stuck closer to the traditional timeline of trying to get this done by January or July 1st. Obviously missed that by a little bit. It was July 3rd when it was ultimately passed. But the process itself still leaves a lot to be desired. There was a significant number of complaints and still complaining going on from sitting legislators right now about being cut out of the many of the decisions and not seeing documents until 20 minutes before they're expected to vote on them and other things. And what's important to remember when you hear those, and you may even hear your own members of the legislature talking about that, is that they're the only ones who can really change this. And so, I think those comments need to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, because if they really wanted the better process, they're the ones in the position. The legislature has to commit to doing this in a way that's more transparent, that's more open for advocates and interested folks like all of us on this webinar today, but also for individual legislators to be able to engage in a meaningful way in the decisions that are being made. What we've seen slowly over the last really couple of decades, but maybe even more pronounced here in the last couple of years, is more and more of this done behind closed doors with fewer and fewer people in the room, really just the top of the legislative leadership making a lot of the decisions and putting together the final documents, and not even giving individual legislators opportunities to really engage in the final product as it's being developed. And that just leads to a process that frustrates a lot of people and really leads to a lot of mistakes, unfortunately, as well, and makes it harder for us to advocate for the priorities that we think they should be focusing on. Okay, that more on that hopefully in the future. Hopefully we can still continue to push for a better process moving forward. But let's talk a little bit about where we're at right now. So, we came into this budget year and throughout this process have recognized that it's going to be a more difficult budget for the state. There's a couple of reasons really why this was coming together. First and foremost were the changes that happened at the federal level, the reconciliation bill that passed last year, over a year ago now. They call it the One Big Beautiful Bill. We call it something else. Really had some dramatic shifts in policy and funding requirements from, shifting a lot of the burden for funding things like Medicaid and SNAP, our Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, shifting more of that burden to the state. And so we knew coming into this year that that would lead to a challenging budget process here at the state level with more priorities or more resources needed from the state end to maintain those programs. Another thing that really impacted that I think has gone a little bit unnoticed or under the radar was the budget agreement that was finally reached last year included the significant road funding component where we dedicated significant state revenues to transportation funding to road repairs for the next several years. And so that had an impact on state revenues available for other priorities this year as well. And so those things combined had us in a position where we knew that this was going to be a bit of a more difficult budget situation than we came in than we've seen in the past few years. What the final product that we ended up with, I think you'll see as we go through this, there's some good and some bad in this. Certainly some prioritization around some positive things, a big investment in out of school time programming that we're supportive of, a shift in codifying a weighted funding formula on K-12 education, which is certainly a positive thing, and some other things that we'll highlight here that we were advocating for and supportive of that did make it into the budget, but also a lot of missed opportunities as resources just weren't there with the but in by and large there was a commitment made in it, and the budget does reflect preservation of Medicaid and SNAP to a large extent at the state level, which is a good thing as well. But overall, the process, as I said, was terrible, and it's kind of a mixed bag on the final product. And we'll get into a lot more of those details here as we move forward. As I said, please think of any questions you might have, anything we don't cover. We'll certainly try to leave time at the end here for folks to ask questions. And if we don't have the information or the answers yet, we'll commit to certainly getting them to you as soon as we can. All right, Stephen. I think that's my overview for now. I think, like I said, we'll turn it over or next slide, I guess. We'll turn it over to Maddie to get started on some of the early childhood highlights.
Thank you, Matt. So from the state budget that just passed, we saw a number of great investments in early childhood and also some big missed opportunities. So it was a bit of a mixed bag. In the GSRP, or the Preschool for All program, it received a $96.1 million increase. That'll mean that total funding for Pre-K for All is $764.7 million. And that will provide preschool for an estimated 68,000 children, which includes a 6% increase to per pupil rates. So it's great to see more investment in preschool. It'll increase the 4-day a week per child allocation, along with the extended GSRP option, increase part day and Head Start blend, and also provide for $3.6 million to help open new GSRP classrooms. In the Child Care Scholarship, or the Child Development and Care Program, providers continue to be paid based on enrollment rather than attendance. There was a concern because the House had proposed changing the payment mechanism for the Child Care Scholarship from paying based on the number of kids enrolled in the CDC program versus the days that the children attend. And in the childcare world, families pay for a childcare slot. Whether or not their child is sick one day or not, they have to pay for that slot to allow for, meeting the costs of teacher pay, and, facilities and curriculum and food. And so we're really happy to see that that will remain the model for the Child Care Scholarship. So the state will essentially pay for the number of children enrolled in the scholarship rather than counting or reducing funding when a child is absent. But there will, however, be more requirements for childcare providers to meet, which we're digging into a bit more. That includes collecting additional data and yeah, I'm a bit concerned that there's already enough burden on childcare programs, and there's a very high standard of reporting that they have to complete. They have to share the number of hours that a child is in care, even though they're paid on enrollment. And so they're already doing quite a bit of reporting. So we'll look into that a bit more and share more in the budget basics that we release in the next few weeks. And unfortunately, there was no increase to the rates that the Child Care Scholarship pays child care programs. This will make it harder for families to find affordable childcare. Some providers may even stop accepting the Child Care Scholarship because this is the second year that we've seen Child Care Scholarship rates remain stagnant. Um, and rates, depending on where you're at in the state, they're often lower than what private pay families have to pay for care. And so that makes it harder for childcare programs to meet their bills, to pay their teachers, and to keep their programs open to serve their community. We also wanted to note that the average childcare wage is about $13.50 an hour, and the minimum wage is increasing to $15 an hour in January. And so we're wondering from like, or asking the state legislature and the governor, how are childcare programs going to increase wages? It's essential that they do that. Childcare teachers deserve to be paid even more than $15 an hour minimum, but the dollars and cents aren't adding up with what they invested for the childcare scholarship, and we're concerned that even some childcare programs could close as a result of the rates remaining stagnant for the second year. So we'll continue to, you know, let lawmakers know that this should not have happened. Um, Also wanted to share that there was a funding hole because the federal government reduced the amount that they funded for the Child Care Scholarship by about $40 million. So the state was able to fill that hole, and they provided $88.1 million. So trying to figure out if there'll be any additional funds. I think that that just accounted for the federal funding hole and also increased caseloads. So more families have been utilizing the Child Care Scholarship over the past few months. And there was also $2 million appropriated for time and attendance billing, for the time and attendance billing system for the Child Care Scholarship. So it's a one-time funding to invest in a time and attendance billing system that assists with meeting federal provider compliance. There's been some new federal rules coming down for Child Care Scholarship programs across the country, so that'll help update that billing system and hopefully make it work better for providers and parents. Next, I wanted to talk about the early learning partnerships. So, as some of you know, Great Start Collaboratives were an institution in the early childhood system for decades. Great Start Collaboratives have a long history of involving parents, early childhood professionals, and program administrators in improving their county's early childhood system. And so, what I mean by an early childhood system is the collection of resources and support programs that parents have access to for their infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. So, do they have access to childcare, early intervention, home visiting, all of those types of services for young kids? And unfortunately, the Great Start Collaboratives funding was cut in last year's budget. Luckily, in this year's budget, that funding was reinstated. And so we got $30 million in funding for early learning partnerships, which is the new iteration of Great Start Collaboratives. And so a little bit more about these partnerships. They'll make it easier for parents to access services like high quality childcare, preschool, early intervention for children with disabilities, home visiting, and more. And they also provide parents with literacy and parenting resources to support the whole child. So that includes their pre-academic skills, their foundational skills for learning, and their social and emotional well-being. And so we're really happy to see that reinstated. Um, this also provides some funding for family engagement centers or family engagement hubs. There are 10 of these hubs across the state, and they, provide some similar supports and work closely with what was formerly Great Start Collaboratives and now is Early Learning Partnerships. New names. And so I guess I can move on to our um, there's also an initiative to strengthen Michigan's early childhood workforce that we're looking into. It was a $21 million investment to strengthen Michigan's early childhood workforce through initiatives including wage pilots, nurture benefits, and other workforce strategies. The wage pilots, I'd assume, would be like increasing wages for childcare teachers and preschool teachers, as we've seen implemented in Michigan, like this year. And Nurture Benefits is a benefit for child care employees and child care directors to get access to health insurance, dental, life insurance, and a few other, critical benefits. So that's, good to see, and we'll share more when we have more information. And I also wanted to share the RX Kids program funding was maintained despite what you might have read in the news over the past few days. RX Kids is the program available in a number of counties across the state. It started in Flint, and essentially it provides pregnant people and people who've given birth with the finances that they really need to, go to their prenatal visits, to get diapers, to buy the, food, clothing, all of the things that are involved in having a baby. That is like the most expensive time in a family's life, and it usually happens when a couple is in their 20s, 30s, when they're like toward the beginning of their career and have the least salary or income. And so RX Kids is able to provide monthly financial support to pregnant people and to people for their kids in the first year of their life. And so luckily that funding was maintained at $20 million. It was split into 5 different line items in the DHHS budget. So we'll have a bit more on that in the future. And I also wanted to share there was a new early childhood investment fund that was funded at $5 million. And this is an initiative that we've been working on with the Think Babies Coalition and other partners. It would essentially be used to distribute funding to qualified childcare providers, with providers and also to preschool as well, to Great Start Readiness Program or Pre-K for All. It would also be used for programs for infants and toddlers, and we're breaking down what all could be included in that. And also, uh, Early On is also included in the investment fund. Early On is Michigan's early intervention program for children ages 0 to 3 who have disabilities and developmental delays. So we're really happy to see that investment fund and the $5 million investment, and we'll be, in future years pushing for more investment. This is a great way for essentially for the state to put funding in like a pot that can only be used for early childhood. So this is a way to kind of protect early childhood funding and build out our system. And finally, mental health consultation. The Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation Program was flat funded, which means just, maintaining current funding at $1.5 million in the Miley budget. And we're unsure if the Department of Health and Human Services will be able to cover the other $1.5 million that's needed to continue to serve childcare programs across the state with preventing suspension, expulsion, and supporting childcare teachers in providing high quality care. So more to come on that. And I will pass it over to Matt.
Actually, I think we're going to go to Bianca, but just real quickly to expand. Thank you, Maddie. A lot obviously in there, and a lot we're still pouring through. Just to expand a little bit on the Innovation Fund. So the idea behind this, as Maddie said, I mean, the $5 million is fine. Obviously, that's not enough money that we know to meet the priorities that we need around early childhood. But the real impetus or idea was that this now better positions early childhood interests when and if a new revenue source becomes available. We've seen in the past several years a number of new revenue streams become available at the state level. Sports gambling was one that came to mind. When marijuana was legalized, recreational marijuana was legalized, these are all then become revenue streams for the state by taxes on those services or on those products or other things. And so then there's always a scramble amongst interest groups on where that revenue should go when the state has the opportunity to generate a new revenue stream. By having this fund established, we think it'll position early childhood supports and services in a better position to say these new revenues should come, or at least a portion of these new revenues should come into that fund and then help us build out, as Maddie said, the entirety of the early childhood system by having some real state revenue investment specifically dedicated to early childhood. All right, Ed, obviously, Maddie covered a lot more things there as well. And like you said, we'll answer questions at the end if folks have them. But now I think we'll turn it over to Bianca to talk about some of the highlights around her child welfare.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Maddie, for kicking us off. So, as we already been talking about a lot, it's a mixed bag with this year's budget. Right now, we are facing this cut. We're now starting to feel the cut from the HR1 or the One Big Beautiful Act bill, where there was significant cuts, which caused a large gap in our Medicaid funding. So we are pretty much sustained and protected with Medicaid and SNAP, but right now we are pulling from internal pots to make sure that pocket is sustained. We were really advocating here in Michigan's Children to push for the tobacco tax to be implemented in this year's budget to help cover some of those costs. In addition, the tobacco tax would have really helped to alleviate youth tobacco use. So we really was hoping to see that come through to help support funding for Medicaid and SNAP at the state level, but this year it did not go through. So we'll continue to look at that, but we are very happy to see that it is maintained and protected so we can ensure that our families and our children aren't hungry or are missing any necessarily health benefits. Additionally, we see Autism Navigator programs back in funding, not what we had 2 years ago in fiscal year 25 at all, where it was $2 million provided for Autism Navigator programs, in which this is a very critical program to ensure that youth or whomever is navigating autism has that person to help navigate accessing those services for them. So we're going to continue to push for that full reinstatement of $2 million. But for now, the 750K is listed in there, and the Autism Navigator program has a line item in our budget, and we are intending for it to stay there and for it to grow so that everyone who needs an Autism Navigator will continue to be supported. As mentioned earlier, we are still coming through child welfare, so there's other details around kinship care and foster care. Kinship care and foster care is definitely protected in there, but we know that we are not doing enough for our kinship care and foster care folks. So we'll be coming through that a lot more in our actual budget basis that'll go out soon. In addition, there were some reductions. A lot of these reductions were due to the large cut that we've had last year. So there was federal cuts to special education, totaling 58.3 million. $2 million was reducted from the new foster care. $5 million was reducted from VOCA backfill, which is the Victims of Crime Act. That was completely cut. This was a very important program that supported our victims of crime, sexual assault, domestic violence, legal counsel, shelters even. We see families who may go through domestic violence situations, sexual assaults, or other various crimes that causes us to be dishoused or unhoused, misplaced, et cetera, et cetera. And this funding was very critical to ensure that those victims didn't have to go through such strenuous times or having to cut costs in other corners just to get the help that they needed. And there was $5 million reduction for behavioral health funding that we've seen as well. So those are some things that we'll continue to look through to see how it may impact our communities throughout the state and how we can possibly find different ways to bring that funding back to our folks. For now, that is what I have on child welfare, and I'm going to pass it over to Pam to talk about runaway and homeless youth.
Thanks, Bianca. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Pam Cornell Allen, and I am a program and policy consultant with Michigan's Children. If you attended our last Lunch and Learn in May, you may remember that I spoke about the line item in the budget that supports services and programming for young people who have run away or experiencing homelessness. And so I am back today to provide some follow-up. Before we get into the numbers, I did want to offer some context that I think is helpful. So, what this funding really supports, what we're talking about are services such as crisis intervention, shelter, counseling, case management, and other supports for young people. And these are offered through contracted agencies around the state. Currently, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services contracts with about, I think it's 22 organizations. So back a couple years ago in fiscal year 23, after more than a decade of flat funding, there was an increase to the allocation that supports this work. The allocation at that point became 13,126,100, with the intent of that increase to support statewide coverage and also expansion of programs. As you might imagine, it took a bit of time to get all of the puzzle pieces into place. But since October of last year, all 83 counties in the state had a designated provider for for services to youth who had run away or experienced homelessness. So that means a young person in crisis anywhere in the state had a resource dedicated for them. Disappointingly, when the budget proposals came out for fiscal year 27, all three reflected a reduction, which would reverse course and put the statewide coverage that was recently achieved at risk. So as you can see from both the governor's office and the Senate, the proposals, the reduction equated to about a 4.6% decrease. The House went even further with a reduction, which amounted to about 10%. And the news I have today is not what we had hoped. Unfortunately, the budget that was passed went even beyond, a little bit beyond any of these proposals, with an allocation of 11,754,500, which equates to almost a 12% cut. We do believe that the reduction is largely the result of the loss of federal TANF dollars. So what we do know is that there will, obviously be implications from the cuts that will look like staffing reductions. It will mean programs will be scaled back, and or possibly coverage areas will be shrunken in many communities. So this is very concerning. And here at Michigan's Children, we have already started to regroup with our partners, talking about things like relationship building and intensifying education efforts with legislators and others. So that is the update I wanted to provide around appropriations for young people who have run away or experiencing homelessness. And I don't know if anyone else would like to chime in, but otherwise, I believe I will pass it over to Heather.
It's on me.
Oh, back to Bianca?
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you for that, Pam. We really are hoping to see more funding come in the future for runaway and homeless youth programming. In addition to that, on a more positive note, we have a major milestone for the My Blueprint team. I don't know if any of our MyPack or Autism Alliance folks or RISE members are in here, but give a clap in the chat as we have intended language reflected in our budget for recommendation in fiscal year 28 to contain a weighted special education funding model. Of course, a lot more has to be done, but we know that this is a journey, not necessarily a destination. And so, as we continue to go through this journey, we'll continue to advocate with our lawmakers as groups to make sure that this is fully in the budget for moving forward. Policies are established, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the intended language that is reflected in the budget, it states the different weighted models that will happen. So just a couple of examples of that. It goes like it's like a spectrum in a sense. So like special language impairment would be considered like 1.1 times the funding, whereas as far as a trauma disorder or autism spectrum disorder receive 3.8 of the funding. So there's about good 10 or 11 different line items listed in the budget that will identify what those ranks will be or the way the student funding will be based on the needs of that child. So we're very excited to see this continue to push forward. We will continue to push on this with our lawmakers. And hopefully next we'll be talking about the high cost fund that we have also wanted to start to become implemented to fully implement the Michigan Blueprint. And with that, we're going to talk more about K through 12 with Matt.
All right, thank you. Bianca and Pam and Maddie and everybody else. So one thing I forgot to mention in my kind of broad general overview is there's a lot of conflicting information out there, I guess, about the overall size of the state budget. And the legislative Republicans in particular, and particularly the House Republicans and Speaker Matt Hall, are really touting the fact that this budget is significantly smaller than what we've seen in past years' state budgets. That's not really true. I mean, there is some reductions and there were some cuts in funding, and there is maybe a slight overall reduction, but the big number of reductions that you see is really just verbiage that instead of incorporating or using the federal funding numbers that are anticipated for Michigan in the overall budget, particularly around education and some other areas. They didn't put those numbers into the budget, but they did include language that any funds from the federal government will be used in the manner that they've been used in the past. And so, the overall numbers don't add up to what we've seen in previous years as far as the overall budget, but the net impact or effect is really minimal as long as there aren't huge, funding decreases at the federal level here in the next year around these programs. We're going to see an overall state budget that's very similar. And so this reduction, even on K-12 side, but even on the overall budget, we've seen a lot of discussion in the media, in the general mainstream media, around the size of the budget. It's really misplaced, a lot of it, and this is more of a messaging point for legislative Republicans to be able to use to say that they've reduced the size of the state budget. But really what most of it is federal funds that will still flow to Michigan and still be utilized in the way that they were, but just aren't counted in these overall numbers. But here are some highlights from the K-12 side. Obviously, a lot going on there. The big issue, one of the big thing that is being talked about, that's a big, huge step forward, not necessarily with the funding levels anywhere near where we need it to be, but as far as moving towards what we see as a real positive, is the implementation of a true weighted funding formula. This is something Michigan Children's worked with. So we're a member of the Michigan Partnership for Equity and Opportunity, more commonly known as MPEO, which was created and led by Ed Trust Midwest, a good partner of ours. And this has really been the focus of that group for a couple of years now, is really getting implemented a true weighted funding formula where you take into real consideration the individual aspects around students in those school districts and try to create a funding formula that recognizes that and addresses that accordingly. We've seen in states that have really started to set the bar and raise their academic achievement levels and their standardized test scores and their overall academic performance in their state education systems, the common theme through the states that seem to be doing better is this implementation of a weighted funding formula and truly recognizing that kids have different needs from an educational standpoint, and a just basic flat funding formula for all students in a state will not move the needle forward on academic achievement. So we're on the way to that. Clearly, it's not funded at nearly the level it will need to be to have the real impact, but the codifying of that is a huge step forward. And then going along with that is some accountability measures that we at MPAO are also pushing hard for. So there's a companion bill with the school aid budget or the education budget. I think it's Senate Bill 903, sponsored by Senator Camilleri, who's the chair of the school aid budget on the Senate side. And this is the first effort, I would say, on really attaching some accountability and transparency measures to districts that receive additional funds through this weighted funding formula to report back to the state and to the legislature and others on what they're using those funds for and the impacts that they're having. And so this is a critical component of it as well. Like anything else, I'm certain that there'll be much learned in this first year of the new implementation of the weighted funding formula and the accountability bill, and we certainly would expect to see modifications and changes as we go through this process next year, and hopefully build upon this weighted funding formula and getting some more money into it to really try to address these challenges. Some other highlights on the school aid side, I mentioned in the beginning, out of school time programming, a $60 million increase. This was on the heels of, we got to $75 million last year, which was a huge number from a state standpoint of state level investment into after school programming or out of school time programming. I think this will put us third or fourth in the country now in the level of state investment into after school programming, just behind New York, which actually counts some other money too. So depending upon how you look at it, maybe even ahead of them. But a big investment. Out of school time programming has seen some real successes. They've been able to demonstrate, these programs have been able to demonstrate that the capacity is there, that the need is there. They consistently have more applications than they have funding for. And they've been able to show some real results as well as far as improving literacy rates and others for the children participating in these programs. And so this is seen as a huge win as well, and something we've been a big part of at Michigan's Children in our work with MASP, the Michigan After School Partnership. There's also $50 million for high impact tutoring. That's going to be run through the Department of Education. That provides individualized evidence-based academic support for tutoring. This is really still another piece of Governor Whitmer's real focus on literacy and improving literacy rates, as hopefully one of her legacy items as she prepares to leave the governor's office. There was once again the $300 million for mental health and school safety. This was a very controversial issue last year, became a controversial issue last year because language was included tied to these funds that school districts, to be eligible for these funds, have to waive some attorney-client privileges in the event of a mass casualty event or a shooting event within their districts. This caused a lot of districts to not pursue this money or to not apply for these funds because based on legal advice that they were getting from their legal counsel around this. That language was continued. There was some modifications to it, but it was essentially continued with some modifications to the language. So it'll be interesting to see. This became another controversial thing here that's arising even since the budget has passed. It'll be interesting to see if the modifications to the language, open it up or have more districts then try to utilize these funds and apply for these funds. Free school meals was included again. This was something that was, there were concerns about as we were in the beginning parts of this budget process, with knowing that there wasn't a lot of state money around on whether or not we'd be able to continue free school and breakfast or lunch and breakfast at public schools. That was continued and was really made a priority by certainly the governor and the Senate as well. What is now controversial about this is there is an opening up of this program, the Free School Meals program, to non-public schools. There's also some money in the budget for teacher retention and efforts for one-time bonus payments and other things for teachers to try to keep teacher retention's been a significant issue for school districts around the state. So that's much needed. That's welcomed, that money in there. But that also was opened up in a slight way for non-public schools as well. The teacher retention program. I am certain that there will be lawsuits filed concerning both of these items by traditional public school groups, arguing that the Constitution prohibits school aid funds from going to non-public schools. This is a fight that happens regularly, that we've seen mixed results in the courts on, and it'll be interesting to see how this one plays out as well. But both those things were included, school meals and some teacher retention money, but opened up slightly to non-public schools as well, which you'll certainly probably be hearing more about as the summer goes on, and I would suspect lawsuits are filed. Next slide, Stephen. I don't know if there's another slide on K-12, but those are some of the big highlights. Like I said, the the weighted funding formula is a big deal. There is a 2.5% increase in the per pupil foundation allowance as well. That had been agreed to by all parties kind of early on in the process. So, more money for schools, some of these directed literacy focused investments, and then continuation of the free school meals and the mental health and school safety items, and then a big increase for out of school time were really the big highlights around the K-12 side. And then I guess I'll turn it over now to Heather and with some information on higher education, and then we'll open it up to questions. I've seen a couple in the chat, but please get ready if you have anything else that we didn't cover that you want to talk about.
So just to continue what Matt was saying, one of the big things this year in higher education, and maybe he already mentioned it, was a $1.7 billion shift from the school aid fund to fund universities and community colleges. And to us, we really see this as an indication that the state needs more revenue. So we hope that the next administration will come in with some more plans and some more actions towards building up state revenue. Because this shift away from the school aid fund has caused a lot of concern. It's one of the highest in history, if not the highest in history. And it's an indication that the state needs more revenue. So that equates to about a 1% operating fund increase for community colleges and our public universities. Michigan Achievement Scholarship got a boost. Most of this is because the number of folks using this scholarship is going up. And so this represents this increase to $532 million, represents covering the anticipated uptake for this scholarship. The AGE for the Michigan Reconnect program, which provides a tuition-free pathway to an associate degree or a technical degree, also dropped from 25 to 21. We're really excited to see that. We think that that will help a number of folks who have graduated from high school, gone into the workforce, and then decided that they did want some sort of a higher education, whether that be vocational or at a university or community college. Tuition incentive program also got a boost. And again, that's mostly related to the growth in the caseload for that. And then the Michigan Future Educator Teacher Stipend Program did well, as well as the Michigan Future Educator Fellowship. So we're excited about that. But other than that, not a tremendous amount of news, except that Michigan needs more revenue. And now I think we'll turn it over for questions and answers.
Yes, and I see some in the Q&A thing that I was able to find. I'm really proud of myself here today. And so we'll jump into those. A couple more just kind of big picture items I'll touch on, and then we'll jump into the Q&A here. And please, any other questions you have, pop them in the chat or in the Q&A here. But as Heather indicated, I mean, the big issue on the budget going into this year, we knew it was going to be tight budget situation in the state because of reduced revenues, and we need more revenues. The governor did propose some modest revenue increases as part of her original budget proposal, as well as a pull down from the budget stabilization fund of about a little over $400 million. None of those made it into the final budget. So the House was clear early on, controlled by Republicans, that they had zero interest in any revenue increases. So even the ones that we thought at Michigan's Children had a real policy advantage as well, like the tobacco tax, the vape tax, and these other things, none of them made it in, unfortunately. And also we did not see a shift from the budget stabilization fund into the general fund to cover some of these shortfalls as well. And so the revenue picture is something that we certainly will be pushing hard for and hoping that others will join us as we get a new administration and a new legislature in here next year. So that's one big picture that kind of came out. I think the other thing that's kind of another thing I didn't mention, and we won't get into in detail here, but we call them LDSIs, legislative directed spending initiatives. This has been a huge part of the budget for the last several years, and these are kind of individual localized projects that legislators fight for. Earmarks essentially is what they are. And we saw a big reduction in those. Now, there still are over 120 of them included in the budget. I think it's about $125 million in total, but that's down. I think last year was over 400 million. And in a couple of years before that, when the COVID money and other stuff was flowing through or still there was up in the neighborhood of $1 billion at times. So we've reduced significantly these earmarks. But it's kind of a mixed bag from us as a child advocacy because there are some good things in there that receive some of these earmarks, but there are a lot of fire trucks and road projects and other things that are funded directly with state general fund dollars in that list as well. So that's something that kind of is a big picture item that we're not going to get into now. I do have a list of all of the projects that were funded. If people want to see that at some point, we can share. And it's included obviously in the budget documents, but I think it was over 120 LDSIs at about $125 million total. Okay, I see some questions in here. First one from Kathy. What do we know about the impact on RX Kids? I know Maddie got into this a little bit. Bianca, I see you want to jump on this. I mean, I'll give my take, I guess, quickly, is there was calls to expand significantly RX Kids, both from the governor's proposal and the original Senate version that we saw. That did not make it to in the final version. Now, the maintenance of funding for current levels did, but the increase or the expansion of RX Kids did not.
Yep.
Bianca?
And
Or
go
Maddie?
ahead, Heather.
Yeah, and I would just note that, this is an amazing program. They just announced recently they've opened up in Ohio, right? So there are a number of other states that are planning to copy this program and reproduce it. This is known nationwide and it's very well regarded on both sides of the aisle. It's a program that has a tremendous amount of transparency. They've got a dashboard that they update every day to make sure that people can see what this money is going for. It's a public-private partnership, so there are philanthropic dollars and donor dollars that go to support moms that are non-citizens. So no public money is ever used for that, but that's been a confusion lately. But this is a fantastic program. Just recently, they came out and announced that the program had reduced neonatal mortality, which is an infant dying in the first 30 days after birth, by 50% in Flint. So the things that this program has done, this is just a stellar example of a public-private partnership that makes it an incredible impact. There's so few programs that can just come in and cut neonatal mortality by 50% right off the top. It's also reduced NICU stays, which are incredibly expensive for the state. It's increased mother well-being. It's reduced CPS calls for infants by significant percentages in all of these things. So this is just a stellar program. And it's disappointing to see it facing these headwinds when really it should just be getting kudos. It's featured in internationally regarded journals. The research is excellent. So we're glad to see that there appears to be a weird sort of approach to continue funding for it, but disappointed to see that it's facing the headwinds that it is.
Okay, next question I see as around the data they're looking for now from the childcare providers. I know, Maddie, you hinted at that, and we're still kind of digging into that. And I would say that, so just in kind of a broad view on this, there was a big push. We've seen this nationally, right? This is all centered around this fraud narrative that Republicans nationally are trying to push around a lot of these social service programs. or safety net programs and others that, and this is how it kind of manifested itself in these budget talks at the state level, was a big push to try to move back towards attendance-based billing from enrollment-based billing in the childcare space. We were able to successfully fight back on that. The negotiation resulted in these additional reporting requirements being placed on providers, but no fundamental shift back to attendance-based billing, which is what a lot of folks were pushing for. So, and I think this will be kind of like the 903 bill on the weighted funding formula is, we'll have to see how this plays out, and it'll kind of be a work in progress, I would suspect, as it becomes implemented and as we start to move through this. And I don't think I see another question related to that. Citizenship status of family members. I'm not sure if that's required, if that's a part of this or not. But we'll certainly dig into that. Next question. I see reporting from major news outlets that the state's budget's reduction in K-12 for special ed is a gimmick and not real. Yeah, I mean, that's what I was hinting at earlier. This notion of the budget being greatly reduced from what current levels or, past years is really just a budget gimmick. There's, nothing to indicate right now that special education at the federal level is going to be cut dramatically and result in a huge reduction in funding available in Michigan. Now, obviously that could happen, and we've seen a lot of attacks from the federal government on funding flowing down to states, but there's nothing in the works right now that would dramatically reduce that. And so this is part of that kind of gimmick where, the legislative Republicans in particular are very eager or anxious to say that they're reducing the size of state government.
What this continues is just this uncertainty that schools have about how much funding they're going to get for special education, and schools have long dealt with this, right? Because the number that the state used to put into the budget was sort of a guess. But now with no number in the budget, it just increases that uncertainty that schools and districts have dealt with. And so it's very likely to just continue the pattern of underinvestment in special education, which has led to the development of the blueprint for special education finance reform that Michigan's Children and the Autism Alliance of Michigan and many other partners have been advocating for and will continue to advocate for. So it really is basically a shell game, but we don't expect special education funding to improve this year with this increased uncertainty, but also districts have dealt with this for a long time. So it's probably going to be about the same as it has been. Matt, would you concur?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the expectation as of now. And yes, I don't, yeah. I mean, and the reality was, even when those numbers were included in the budget, there was still the option or the possibility that things could happen at the federal level that could greatly reduce those funds. And so I think the net impact is really minimal at this point right now. All right, next questions. I'm going to try to roll through these because I know we're running out of time. What is Michigan's Children's response to the federal OMB proposed rule changes to terminate federal funds, grants, agreements to states and nonprofits that address issues, training, other things not in line with federal goals? We were actually a part of, I was on, I think, Heather, you were as well yesterday, a call with some of our federal partners where this was discussed in detail. We're certainly opposed to that. We'll be providing information and opportunities for other folks and for our partners to engage and sign on letters and public comment periods, and others opposing this as well. This is a big concern, obviously, for a lot of folks. At Michigan's Children, we are a nonprofit, obviously, but we don't take any public funds. So it doesn't impact us directly, but we know a lot of our partners, a lot of you all do, and are relying upon this. And this is a big concern moving forward. So something we'll be watching closely, absolutely. And then Bobby, I did see, so a couple of things here. So there was, and I should have talked about this more, but I knew we were limited on time. There were a number of policy bill packages that passed kind of in connection with the budget. And this has become typical in recent years as things are getting negotiated around the budget, that some ancillary policy measures get included in the negotiations, especially when we have divided government like this. And so we did see some things like around foster care, protecting foster care or kids in foster care benefits and other things that are real positives. We'll be reporting on all of those once we get through the numbers on the budget stuff as well. But there were some good things. Now, the problem is, as Bobby alluded to in his question, there's a number of things that didn't get included in those negotiations. There's a water affordability plan he referenced, but there's a number of other policy bills and packages of bills that we've been working on throughout the year that did not get included. And now the question becomes, what are the prospects of them getting passed before the end of the year? And that's really a difficult question to answer. What we do not expect to see the legislature in Lansing much at all for the rest of the summer, certainly. And to what extent they are in session or actively moving legislation through the fall remains to be seen. Historically, what we would see is, then a lame duck session that would occur after the election, before the end of the year, where there'd be a lot of negotiations and opportunities to move a lot of these policy bills. That's kind of an open-ended question at this point now, and really depends upon what the results of the election are. When we have divided government like this, it really truly takes a significant negotiation between the parties to move a lot of these policy bills. What'll happen is, if we have a situation where in the election, if one party, we get a trifecta, we call it, where one party will assume control next year of the governor's office and both chambers of the legislature, they really have no incentive to negotiate right now or during that lame duck session with the other party. They feel like they might as well just wait until the new year, when they can negotiate with each other or amongst each other on these issues. And so if that's the situation, if we get a trifecta one way or the other, either Republican or Democrat, there's a very real possibility we don't see much of a lame duck session at all. There'll be some stuff that has to be done. They have to close the books and do some other process-oriented stuff, but we may not see any real meaningful negotiations on some of these packages, which is unfortunate, because there's been a lot of work done on a lot of these things, and a lot of them are fairly ready to go and would be good policy. So we'll certainly keep people updated. That can change. There could be opportunities even this fall, probably after the primary. We're certainly not expecting to see much, if any, legislative activity between now and the primary, which is coming up here August 4th. But there could be some opportunities in the fall if there are issues that arise. And there could also be, things that happen at the federal level that will dictate or require the state legislature to come in and work on some issues as well. And so, a lot of uncertainty politically, but it is concerning for anything that did not get included in the negotiation when the budget passed. The prospects of that are daunting at this point. I did see a question from Erica as well around expanding the community college guarantee for people that don't live in community college districts. I think that's a great issue, certainly one that we're supportive of at Michigan's Children. And I would expect and almost hope that we would see these gubernatorial candidates talking about. It seems like a perfect issue for a gubernatorial candidate to jump on, to expand upon the community college guarantee that's been implemented here in Michigan to really truly reflect the entire state. And so I'm hopeful that becomes a part of the election conversation here as we move forward.
Yeah, and I would just note that I see in the comments a lot of questions around the reporting requirements for childcare providers. We will not be having our early childhood advocates meeting this month in July. We usually take that month off, but we will come back in August and have some answers for you, and that will be part of that meeting. So if you're interested in joining that group or joining that meeting, please send an email to Maddie or to info at Michigan's Children, and we'll make sure that gets to Maddie. But we will have some answers. I think it's going to take a little bit of time for us to figure that out. So thank you for those questions. And we will be sure to be sending out some information on that as we're able to gather it.
All right. Well, we are at 1:00. Thanks everybody for joining. And stay tuned for more information from us. Like I said, we'll be getting our budget basics out, which will have more detail on all these issues. And please do not hesitate to reach out to any of us. Our emails are just our first names at michiganschildren.org. And we'll certainly share information and opportunities to engage on some of these other important things like the OMB role and others coming up here through the summer. Thanks, everybody.